The War for Independence. If historiographers should be hardy enough to fill the page of history with the advantages that have been gained with unequal numbers on the part of America, in the course of this contest and attempt to relate the distressing circumstances under which they have been obtained, it is more than probable that posterity will bestow on their labors the epithet and marks of fiction, for it will not be believed that such a force as Great Britain has employed for 8 years in this country would be baffled in their plan of subjugating it by numbers infinitely less, composed of men oftentimes half-starved, always in rags without pay, and experiencing at times every species of distress which human nature is capable of undergoing. George Washington, 1783. The American Revolution, like most successful revolutionary struggles, involved violence and bloodshed, but it also brought about significant transformations. If the revolution had not succeeded militarily, the state constitutions would have been revoked, the United States Constitution would never have been written, and the social, cultural, and economic changes that resulted from the separation from Britain would not have taken place. And of course, as we know, they took inspiration from the Greeks, the democracy of the Greeks, which never had a constitution, the Republic of Rome, which was not necessarily democratic, but nevertheless had a constitution. And of course, how was it possible for the 13 colonies, often fractious and suspicious of one another, to prevail over Great Britain, which after her defeat of France in the French and Indian War had become 18th century Europe's dominant superpower? George Washington said at the conclusion of hostilities that the question would always challenge historians, for the outcome bore all the marks of fiction. Not surprisingly, then, most scholars until recent years have maintained that Britain had not taken advantage of her vast resources, a professional army, the world's most powerful navy at the time, and Europe's most sophisticated financial and industrial complex. Moreover, they claimed the British war effort suffered from mediocre political and military leadership. America's failure in the Vietnam War, for example, generated new perspectives on the superpowers engaging in conflicts in distant parts of the world. Problems of public opinion at home, logistics, and an unfamiliar environment where traditional methods of fighting and campaigning came up short also could explain in some measure Britain's inability to maintain its hold on the 13 colonies. Moreover, Britain confronted an aroused countryside, angry citizens at arms who brought about both a political and a military revolution. The 18th century, respectively, and its military system, with its highly trained armies and upper-class officers, faced a new challenge, one that would be repeated in the era of the French Revolution and countless times in the next 2 centuries. This simple fact explains one great, often overlooked advantage of the American revolutionaries. And this is a professor of history who gave this article. It's by Don Higginbotham, professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. George Washington had an interesting view of history. He said that we ought not to look back, he said, unless it is to derive useful lessons from past errors and for the purpose of profiting by dear-bought experiences. If they agreed with Washington, those who have modeled the national park system, for example, must have felt that Washington's life had many lessons to teach. Of course, no one is better represented by the National Park Service and their sites by no one other than George Washington, from his Virginia birthplace to his first test and battle to the sites of his inaugurations as the first United States president. The plantation of Augustine Washington embraced son George. The child's formative influences included a financially comfortable family living on a rural Virginia plantation dependent on enslaved Africans. The frontier battlefield location of Fort Necessity sheds light on Washington's development as a military officer. And chosen commander of the Continental Army by Congress, meeting in Independence Hall, Washington took up headquarters in a Cambridge, Massachusetts house, later purchased by poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Following his retreat from New York, Washington helped New Jersey earn its reputation as the crossroads of the Revolution. And with Washington in command, more battles occurred in the state of New Jersey than in any other state. Valley Forge and Morristown reveal Washington's struggle to keep his army intact and his willingness to defer to civilian control of the military. In 1781, Washington marched his army through New Jersey again, now accompanied by French allies. On the way to Yorktown, his leadership on the battlefield persuaded many that they needed him in national service after the war. First as president of the Constitutional Convention when it met in Independence Hall, and then as a U.S. president when the New York and then Philadelphia served as the nation's capital. The National Park Service, it seems, is intent on allowing generations of visitors to rediscover useful lessons in Washington's past errors and dear-brought experiences. Initially, they controlled the local infrastructure everywhere, and of course, as well as the colonial assemblies as well. The colonial assemblies, now calling themselves provincial congresses, and after 1776, state legislatures continued to dominate the domestic sector, making laws that threatened or coerced people who opposed the rebellion. Of course, their chief weapons for securing the home front were the old colonial militias, activated and reorganized, of course, and as a result, the Crown's adherents, the Loyalists or Tories, remained mostly silent or ineffectual, except when a British army arrived to rally or embolden them. Washington said that nothing can be more hurtful to the service than the neglect of discipline, for that discipline, more than numbers, gives one army the superiority over another. The Continental Congress, made up of representatives from the colony states, topped the Revolutionary Command structure. Local authorities deferred to Congress in the interest of securing independence, especially after it became apparent by early 1776 that Britain intended to continue to resolve the imperial crisis by means of a military rather than a political solution. The Declaration, for example, of Independence, however, did not mean that the American states were ready to create a strong national government. Instead, Congress existed as an extra-legal institution until its efforts to establish a loose constitutional union, the Articles of Confederation, was ratified in the year 1781. The Articles essentially confirmed the jurisdiction that the states had informally bestowed upon the Congress at the outset: the power to raise military forces, conduct foreign relations, deal with Indian tribes, coin money, and set up a post office. After the Boston Tea Party on the 16th of December in 1773, Britain had sent several thousand troops to the Massachusetts capital and appointed the military commander in North America, General Thomas Gage, governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Tensions built and fighting erupted on the 19th of April in 1775 when a British column seeking to destroy militia supplies at Concord came under heavy fire as it fell back through Lexington, seeking the safety of Boston. Hundreds of men from nearby towns joined in the assault. The column under Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith might have been annihilated, and Gage not sent out support under General Hugh Earl Percy. Before the exhausted, frightened regulars made good their escape, they had suffered 274 casualties, as opposed to 93 American casualties. The attackers, such as their numbers, swelling to almost 20,000, as all of the New England colonies joined Massachusetts in the conflict, quickly encircled the land side of Boston and confined the British there. Nearly 2 months later, on the 17th of June, Gage endeavored to retake the Charleston Peninsula. His troops won the misnamed Battle of Bunker Hill on Breed's Hill, but it was one of the numerous costly victories in the entire war. Of course, the British swept up the terrain of Bunker Hill only to be driven back with heavy losses before they finally prevailed, too bloodied and disorganized to follow up their hollow accomplishment. And one British officer called it a dear-brought victory. Another victory like it would have ruined us. And of course, later that June, in response to a plea from Massachusetts, Congress agreed to adopt the New England militia forces. They became the Continental Army, and the delegates chose George Washington of Virginia as commander-in-chief of this army. The appointment of a leader from the South would be another step in making it truly an American war, not just a New England enterprise. But even so, General George emerged as the best candidate in his own right. As a prominent figure in the resistance movement prior to entering Congress, He had proved his military credentials with impressive service in the French and Indian War. Wearing his old uniform in Congress, Washington signaled his readiness to serve. He had been outside the military profession for more than 17 years, however, but military theory and technology had scarcely changed, and the British generals he would face had been only majors and colonels in the last war with France, or colonels. Washington arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts to take command of the newly designated Continental Army in the month of July in 1775, beginning an 8.5-year assignment, a record of continuous service without a leave of absence, unparalleled in all of American history. From his headquarters, a mansion abandoned by a fleeing Loyalist family, Washington confronted the first of his numerous challenges in the Revolutionary War: containment of British forces in Boston. It proved easier than he might have thought. This opponent, General Sir William Howe, who replaced Gage, hardly relished another bloodbath after Bunker Hill. And as it turned out, the more pressing challenge was to bring order and discipline to the New England militiamen ringing the city. They were ill-disciplined, poorly trained, and plagued by rivalries among different provinces. Of course, furthermore, the civilian population had a long history of opposing military forces in their presence. If George Washington whipped his regiments into shape, he also created a common bond in the army and bolstered the prestige and authority of the Continental Congress. He made it very clear that he took orders only from Congress, even as he remained tactful in dealing with Massachusetts civil authorities. In all these endeavors, however, he set precedents that he would follow throughout the conflict. Washington also said that our cruel and unrelenting enemy leaves us only the choice of brave resistance or the most abject submission. We have therefore to resolve to conquer or die.